In this video, you will configure Open Shortest Path First, OSPF routing to the Forcepoint next generation firewalls. Our goal is to advertise the network 10.0.0.024 from the internal cluster to the external router and to advertise the default route from the external router to the NGFW clusters. Network 172.16.0.024 is between the external router and external cluster. Network 192.168.0.024 is between the internal and external clusters. In the Forcepoint NGFW, dynamic routing is configured in firewall properties using reusable configuration elements. In the SMC, navigate to Configuration, NGFW, Other Elements. Dynamic routing elements. Expand OSPF v2 elements. When configuring dynamic routing, you will first create the necessary elements and then configure dynamic routing in firewall properties. Default system elements exist for most of the OSPF configuration elements. If these are suitable for your environment, you can use them. If default elements do not satisfy your requirements, you need to create your own elements with the required configuration. OSPF v2 areas are used to define which area the interface belongs to. Right-click the empty area list and create a new area. Name is simply used for the administrator's convenience. Area ID defines the OSPF area number. Area 0 is a backbone area and other areas connect to it. Only Area 0 will be configured as the network is quite small. Area type and default interface settings can be changed if suggested defaults are not suitable. When the necessary elements have been configured, you will enable OSPF in Firewall Properties. Select External Cluster, edit Firewall Cluster External Cluster. Routing, Dynamic Routing. And then select Enable OSPF v2. Router ID can be defined manually, or the system can select it automatically. The highest loopback cluster virtual IP address, CVI, is favored when automatic router ID selection is used. If there are no loopback addresses, then the highest CVI is used. Routes learned via dynamic routing do not update anti-spoofing, so you will need to configure this manually. Networks added to additional networks to automatically add to anti-spoofing will be allowed through anti-spoofing in any interface that has dynamic routing enabled. Alternatively, you can configure anti-spoofing manually. To enable OSPF routing in the interface, add the OSPF area under it. The IP network determines the source address of sent OSPF packets. You do not need to define neighbors, as OSPF will find them automatically. You can override default interface settings from the area or enforce communication mode if needed. In the NGFW, you will need to refresh the policy so the configuration changes take effect. After the policy refresh, OSPF routing is started in the firewall. Under Monitoring Routing you will find the external router has already been configured, so you will see that the external cluster has learned the default route from it. After you have verified that external cluster OSPF routing works, it is time to configure OSPF to the internal cluster. OSPF routing is enabled in the Dynamic Routing menu. Anti-spoofing must be updated manually when dynamic routing is in use. OSPF is enabled in the interface by adding an OSPF area to the IP network. There are no OSPF neighbors in the 10.0.0.024 network, but the intention is simply to advertise the network via OSPF. Therefore, you set the communication mode to passive. The firewall will not try to establish an OSPF neighborhood via the passive interface, but will include it in OSPF advertised routes. Refresh the policy on the internal cluster to apply the OSPF configuration. In routing monitoring, you will see that the internal cluster has learned the default route via OSPF. The external cluster also advertises the network between it and the external router, as OSPF has been enabled on that interface. The external cluster has now learned about all the routes in network 10.0.0.024 from the internal cluster via OSPF. Finally, you can see that the external router has learned the route to network 10.0.0.024 from the external cluster via OSPF.